Hello and welcome to the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. I'm Ralph Russo, the college football writer with the Associated Press. A two-guest week on the show, where we'll get into some on-the-field and off-the-field stuff in the world of college sports. First up, we'll talk with Gabe Feldman, the director of Tulane University's sports law program. We'll talk about the NCAA's day in front of the Supreme Court last week. We'll also ask Gabe to get us up to date on where things stand with the NCAA's NIL reforms and whether the association will get help from Congress before a bunch of state laws go into effect in early July. Then we're going to dive into the state of Florida. Matt Baker from the Tampa Bay Times joins me to chat about the Gators and Noles, and we'll toss a few questions to Matt about Gus Malzahn at UCF and how the spring has been for the Hurricanes down in Miami. Thanks for listening to the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. You can find us on Westwood One Podcast, Apple Podcast, just about anywhere you like to get your podcast. If you like what you hear, give us a good review and a good rating. It helps college football fans find us, and it helps us find more college football fans. If you'd like to email the show, send questions and comments to aptop25mailbag@gmail.com. That's aptop25mailbag@gmail.com. And away we go. Joining me first on the podcast this week is Gabe Feldman. Gabe is the director of the sports law program at Tulane University. Did I get that title right there, Gabe?
Perfect, Ralph.
Excellent. Or sports law guy on Twitter, right? That's the other place people can find you.
And the Between the Lines podcast.
Please absolutely promote your podcast. Everybody's got a podcast because honestly, it is a great place to go to find conversation about college sports or sports in general, but especially college sports for my listeners off the field, and a place where you can go get some complicated things explained in an easily understood way. So what's the podcast?
Between the Lines, a podcast about sports and the law.
Excellent. Well, Gabe does a great job, and he does a great job educating me on how to sort through things like NIL, NCAA issues, and the Supreme Court. The NCAA went in front of the Supreme Court last week. I believe it was Wednesday. And in the case is an appeal of the Alston case. That's a term or a case name that I think a lot of my listeners are familiar with. It was a former West Virginia football player who brought this case a long time ago. He is in many ways the Alston case. It's called the Alston case, but he is more of a symbolic figure here. It's not like Sean Alston is out like promoting this case much, but it has a chance to be a big deal because it could change the way colleges are allowed to compensate athletes. I'm not going to ask you to predict what will happen after you heard the arguments, but give me your impression of what were the things that interest you most about the arguments last week? The questions that went to the plaintiffs, the questions that went to the NCAA that most intrigued you.
I would say there were a couple of things. One is, and keep in mind, they start by asking the NCAA's lawyer questions. And so you could say the first half of the arguments, they were attacking the NCAA. And this was everyone from Justice Thomas to Sotomayor across the political spectrum. And the consistent theme was, wait a minute, something seems very wrong about college sports. At least at the top of the football and men's and women's basketball, that there are billions of dollars of revenue being generated and very little of it is going to the college athletes. And to a justice almost, they expressed that this seemed unfair. Justice Kavanaugh described it as exploitation. So that was notable to hear that they all were uncomfortable with the current system. On the flip side, when we went to the second half or the third quarter of the argument, when they were questioning the plaintiff's lawyer, Jeff Kessler, they were also almost all concerned that if the plaintiffs won this case, there would be no stopping the compensation that college athletes would get. So it might start with what was at issue here, benefits related to education, relatively small things like musical instruments and post-eligibility internships. But then before we know it, the college athletes will be paid in full to play. And that would lead to the destruction of college sports. And the justices were worried about destroying college sports. So it was interesting on the one hand that they were sort of appalled at the state of college sports and the unfairness for college athletes. And on the other hand, worried about destroying this thing that they are appalled about. So it seemed like many of us, we want to help fix the system, provide athletes with more rights, but not destroy it at the same time. And it wasn't clear to the justices, I think, how that could happen under antitrust law.
Right. And so I guess the next question is, what's the legal question here? And is there a legal remedy? Because it's one thing for us to talk about the NCAA goes in front of the Supreme Court and amateurism is on trial. Like, we can sort of talk about it in those ways, but that's not really what's happening here. There are more narrow legal arguments being settled here. Can you explain the sort of more narrow legal arguments as opposed to just this idea, again, like, lay people like me like to put the NCAA on trial, but that's not really what's happening here.
It's not, but that's what was interesting about many of the comments by the justices is they were acting like fans, which often happens when a judge hears a sports case. They are worried about what's going to happen to the sport, what's going to happen to my athlete, my favorite team. But the legal issue really ties into those two arguments I just mentioned. And the case here was about, it started with a lawsuit trying to remove all limitations on athlete compensation. So the O'Bannon case that some of your listeners might be familiar with was a challenge to restrictions on name, image, and likeness in video games and television. This was an attempt to just eliminate all restrictions, have the schools pay whatever they want for whatever they want for these college athletes. It got narrowed as the case went on to just being about a certain category of payments, and those are benefits related to education. Because the NCAA has argued for decades that they need to maintain amateurism in order to differentiate college sports from pro sports. And that the way that they define amateurism and the courts have defined amateurism over the last decade or so is that college athletes can only receive compensation related to education. If they get any money unrelated to education, then that destroys amateurism, that destroys the distinction between college and pro, and that will destroy the interest in college sports. So in this case, it was really just to focus on some education-related benefits, either what they call non-cash, which would be science equipment, musical instruments, again, internships, and then cash benefits, so academic awards, incentives for doing well, for getting a certain GPA. And the legal question the court asked was, are the restrictions that the NCAA currently has in place that would prevent athletes from getting these additional benefits, are those restrictions reasonably necessary to maintain amateurism, or the way that the NCAA has defined amateurism? If they are reasonably necessary, they'll be upheld. If they're not, they'll be struck down. So that's really the core legal question. But the bigger issue, and the reason why amateurism may in fact be on trial, we'll see what the Supreme Court decides, is the Supreme Court has an opportunity to say, wait a minute, this amateurism argument isn't really a legitimate antitrust argument. And if they strike down the amateurism argument, it'll be a narrow loss in terms of what the plaintiffs get here, but it would be a massive loss for the NCAA because it would open the door for future lawsuits that would ask for not just education-related benefits, but NIL payments and then potentially pure pay for play.
Right. So in that case, in that ways, amateurism is on the line here. And I think when I had a chance to talk to Donald Remy, who is the chief legal officer for the NCAA, they are very quick to point out sort of the narrowness of this and how really, I guess, and I'd be interested in your take on this, and we have talked about this in different settings here. One of the things Donald Remy pointed out to me when we talked about this case before it was heard was this idea of it's about who decides what is best for college sport. Who should make the rules for college sports? Should it be the NCAA or should it be other entities? Should it be federal judges? Because even that came up too, the idea of will this ruling take power away from the NCAA and all of a sudden you will have courts and lawmakers, possibly state and or federal lawmakers, and we'll get into more of that when we talked about NIL, that should be the vehicle by which college sports are governed. And how does that play into this case? Because it did seem like some of the justices brought that up.
Yeah, it is, and it's a point the NCAA and pro sports leagues have argued for a century, that this is a private association, the NCAA. These schools come together to create this league that could not exist without their cooperation, and that they're allowed to define their product. They're allowed, just like any other industry or competitor or group of competitors can define the product they produce. The NCAA is allowed to define their product, and they define it as amateur sports. And they define amateur, again, as you're a student and you're also not paid beyond your education-related expenses. And then there's the question of, all right, well, what is an education-related expense? And is it the internship? Is it the musical equipment? What is reasonable? And the NCAA says, well, we get to decide that. This is our product. And it wouldn't make any sense to have courts come in and say, well, you can allow that, but not that. You can allow the musical equipment, but not the internship, or you can allow a certain amount of cash payments based on the academic performance, but not others. That's not what antitrust law is designed to do. And the courts are not in a position to second guess the NCAA as to how they produce their product. So the NCAA's argument, sort of threshold argument, is the court should stay out of this. As long as it's an amateurism rule, we get to make the decision. And their basis for saying that is a previous Supreme Court decision, the 1984 Board of Regents case, where the Supreme Court suggested that as long as it is the type of rule that has to do with amateurism and eligibility, then the NCAA deserves significant deference. And the NCAA is saying, hey, you're not giving us deference here. You are micromanaging our business. And the plaintiffs say, well, wait a minute. You're just like any other competitor in the country. Yes, you have a right to create your product, unless in creating your product and defining your product, you are harming competition. And in this case, it's clear. And it wasn't even an issue at the trial or at the Supreme Court that college athletes are being harmed. And the NCAA's lawyer admitted it as much. It was sort of striking to hear. The NCAA's lawyer said college sports, or at least college football and college basketball, are defined by the restrictions on the compensation that the college athletes receive. And in order to maintain that product, the NCAA has to have leeway to enforce these amateurism restrictions. So it is a bit about who gets to make the decisions on how to define and enforce amateurism. Is it the NCAA or is it the courts? And several of the justices said, well, I don't want to be involved in this. I don't know what I'm talking about. I don't know what college sports should or shouldn't be. That's not why we are here. And so that'll be an issue that'll at least be, I think, implicitly decided by the court, if not explicitly.
Okay, one last question on this, because I remember when this case was ruled upon by the circuit court judge, and it was a loss for the NCAA. But then when I called smart people like you and others who could explain what exactly that meant, it sort of was a loss that felt like a win. Because as you referenced before, the plaintiffs were shooting a lot higher than just education related benefits. And if you narrow it down to simply education related benefits, well, that puts it in a relatively small space where it puts a lot of limits, natural limits on where you can go with a benefit, where you can go with compensation. Now, what you always hear from the NCAA, and when it comes to NIL or just about anything else, anywhere compensation is involved, there is also the concern about corruption, right? It's just another avenue to corruption. All that said, is there a way that the NCAA can lose again, but also have it be relatively narrow as far as the ruling and come away sort of dusting itself off, thinking like, yeah, we did all right here?
Yeah, they could. And it's a great question. And it's what makes it so difficult to predict what might happen, because I would say the two sort of broad categories of possible outcomes would be obviously either the NCAA wins or the plaintiffs win, but then also it'll be a narrow win or a big win on the law. And that's what I think ultimately the NCAA is more concerned about, and the plaintiffs to an extent as well. But the NCAA could lose the case, and the Supreme Court could uphold the circuit court's decision, which said some of their restrictions violate antitrust law, and they have to open up these education-related benefits completely when they're non-cash and then somewhat when they're cash. if the Supreme Court says that, but the amateurism defense otherwise is still a valid defense. And as long as the NCAA is putting a restriction on a non-education related benefit, it is permitted. They can't restrict education related benefits. They can restrict non-education related benefits. So they might lose this case because they are restricting some non-education related benefits, but they would sort of win the war because it would mean that they could continue to restrict every other form of compensation. And it would be kind of Board of Regents Part 2, because Board of Regents, the Supreme Court ruled against the NCAA. They said your television restrictions are illegal, but it would be valid and legitimate for you to restrict athlete compensation. So it could be sort of deja vu all over again, where they lose the narrow ruling, but get the amateurism defense, which is really what they want and really why they've gone back to the Supreme Court to say, hey, we are tired of being sued. Yeah. And every time we change a rule, we get sued under antitrust law because either we're restricting compensation like we've done for a long time, or when we loosen the restrictions, we haven't loosened them enough. And so they are desperately seeking immunity from antitrust law, both from the Supreme Court to the extent they can. It wouldn't be complete immunity, but they want deference. And then also from Congress, which I think we'll talk about in a minute. But that's their end game. They don't want to be continuously sued under antitrust law.
Right, because when they tried to change we'll change the subject here, their name, image, and likeness rules, and this is not necessarily to allow. It's not only not necessarily, it's not at all really the way the proposals are structured right now. For colleges to pay athletes, but to allow third parties to pay athletes for their fame, for their skill of being basically for being an athlete, right? I mean, It sounds it's as simple as that. As of right now, athletes can't be paid for being good at athletics.
Other than your scholarship.
Other than your scholarship, right? So with name, image, and likeness, we are trying to move this aircraft carrier to turn this ship around very, very slowly. It has gone about, but all the reform there seems to be in a bit of a quagmire right now, where the NCAA was trying to do some reforming and pass some rules, and that got slowed down by the Department of Justice in January. And now there are state laws that are on the verge of going into effect in July. And there are federal lawmakers who are sort of saying, yeah, we'll help you, but we're going to help you on our terms. And by the way, we got other things to do. And the NCAA is still sort of frozen in time here, wondering if it should move forward because if that's going to be okay with the DOJ. So that's a really ragged way of laying out what's going on. But I would ask you, Gabe, do you have a sense of like what is next? What do you think is the viable or the likely next couple of steps here to get out of the quagmire?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there are a lot of factors the NCAA is concerned with right now, and you laid it out really well. And just in terms of the big ship, that's what people often say, and people in the NCAA say, look, we want to make change, but it takes a long time to turn the ship because there are thousands of schools and different interests. And that's fair as a general matter, but they've had years to turn the ship. I mean, the iceberg was out there for decades. They knew this was coming. And so it's a little harder to stomach or take we need time to make change because people have been calling for this change for a long time. That said, they seem to be at a point where they are ready, I think for a lot of the reasons you talked about, to make the change because of the litigation pressure and the pressure at the state and federal level. But as of now, 7 states have passed NIL laws. There is an 8th one coming any day. There should be a handful more coming after that. The key point about these NIL laws, as you said, is that this would allow third parties, not the schools, but third parties to pay college athletes for their name, image, and likeness. And these laws would take effect, some of them, July 1, 2021, so just a few months away. There is activity at the federal level. 2 bills have been introduced this year. We might expect 2 or 3 more that would also provide NIL compensation rights for college athletes. But some of the bills would provide much, much more than that. So the Booker-Blumenthal College Athlete Bill of Rights, which was introduced last year and sounds like will be reintroduced again soon. NIL is just really the starting point. It would also give college athletes greater health benefits, insurance coverage, and here's the big one, it would allow or require schools to share some of their revenue with their athletes. If they earn enough in revenue or profit, they would have to share some of it with the athletes like we see at the pro level. And that's, I think, what the NCAA is most afraid of. But any of these changes they're afraid of because they're not making the change. And like we talked about a few minutes ago, the NCAA wants to be the one who gets to make the decisions. All we've talked about here are now state legislators, federal legislators, and the Supreme Court might be the ones making the decision. So at a certain point, something's got to come to a head. Something's got to give. Someone's going to make a decision. And the NCAA is, again, trying desperately to have the Supreme Court rule that it shouldn't be judges, it shouldn't be plaintiffs' attorneys. They are trying to ask Congress to say, give us an antitrust exemption so we don't have to worry about these plaintiffs' attorneys or the courts. They're also trying to get Congress to say, we don't have to worry about these state laws, which are going to be different across the states and might provide more rights for certain athletes just because they go to school in a particular state versus another. So Congress, you got to help us. But as you said, Congress has a lot of other things on their plate. The clock is ticking. Florida, among other laws, are scheduled to take effect July 1. They are going to continue to try to get Congress to stop those laws from taking effect. If they don't, if Congress doesn't act, now it doesn't mean they won't eventually act, but if they don't get them to act by July 1, it may be that the NCAA has to sue the state of Florida and multiple other states to try to stop those laws from taking into effect. And their argument would be, we run a national collegiate athletic association, right? That's why we're called the NCAA. And we need uniform rules across the states. We have to have a relatively level playing field. So we can't have Florida have one set of rules, California have a different set of rules, and New York have no rules. Let's just take, for example. So they're going to ask the court to step in and stop the states if somebody else doesn't stop the states, if Congress doesn't stop the states. And what makes it even more complicated is while this is all happening, the Supreme Court may rule. And then we have to add the Supreme Court's decision into the different arguments they're making. So the analogy I've used before is the NCAA is kind of juggling fiery knives right now, that any one of them could sort of take apart not only the structure of college sports, but getting back to that threshold issue, can take apart their control over college sports. And even if it's just NIL now, and it's amazing we're saying just NIL. 10 years ago, NIL seemed like the biggest thing possible, but now it may just be the starting point. The NCAA's concern is if we lose control over this, we're going to lose control over everything. And they're trying to make that argument to as many different people as they can, hoping some of them will buy it and some of them will stop all these challenges.
I'm going to ask you basically like one more follow-up question on this, and that is, and it's more of just your opinion than anything else, because I don't think this is where they're heading. But do you think the NCAA is still in a position where it might be able to retake control of this situation? Because I've heard from some people within the industry that, listen, if they really wanted to step up, and I hate to say they, because the NCAA is not an autonomous body. The NCAA is the schools. I'd like to re-explain that every once in a while. Mark Emmert does not sit over the college sports the way Roger Goodell does the NFL. However, if NCAA rules, if the NCAA like sort of dusted itself off and say, you know what, we're going to pass some NIL rules and we're going to see if that makes some of these states stand down. Maybe we can get to a place where we have our rules set in a way that makes some federal lawmakers and some state lawmakers go, okay, you actually did something that looks not that similar to what we were going to do. So maybe we will back off here. Is that just an outlandish proposition at this point because lawmakers sense a wounded animal in the NCAA, so why let them off the hook? Or do you think there is a reasonable path that the NCAA could step up and say, listen, we're going to try to reestablish ourselves, take control of this situation, and alleviate some of this pressure?
I think that path has existed. The question is whether it still exists and whether they have time to go down that path and whether they have the will to go down that path. Because that is part of what they said to members of Congress during multiple congressional hearings last summer, that, hey, let us take care of this. You guys don't have to do it. We'll do it. Just give us an antitrust exemption. Just stop these pesky states and stop these plaintiffs.
And I should point out a narrow antitrust exemption. They weren't necessarily looking for a broad antitrust exemption. At least that's what they'll say. Now maybe they would like something more broad, but what they have said is a more narrow antitrust exemption that will sort of cover just name, image, and likeness.
Potentially, but if you look at the language in the Rubio bill,
is that one thing that they say something, but really, if you go a little deeper, it might mean something else?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think ultimately they want an antitrust exemption for their amateurism model.
Okay.
And NIL is the first example of a potential real attack on the amateurism model.
Okay.
So I don't, you're right. It could be narrow to just allow NIL and not allow them to be sued over their NIL restrictions.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I don't think they would shy away from preferring a broader one that would still be narrower than they're exempt for everything, but they're at least exempt when it comes to their amateurism restrictions. But they had said, we'll have our proposals approved by January to take effect in August of 2021. And I think if they had done that, then that might have had Congress back off a little bit, may have convinced some of the states to back off a little bit. I'm not sure about the states, but certainly would have been more helpful for Congress. But in January, they decided not to vote on it. They decided to wait, in part potentially because of the letter from the Department of Justice, in part maybe because they were waiting for the Alston case to be decided, in part maybe because they still can't agree on what the rules should be. But I think that's hurt them because they've already said once, hey, just wait, we'll do it. And then their deadline for doing it passed. Now, there may be explanations for why that deadline passed, but it passed. And then think about what has happened in the interim and what's gone on in the last few weeks with the NCAA tournament. Although a success based on the excitement of many of the games, the disparity of the treatment between men and women is a major issue, and major issue that the NCAA recognizes is a major issue. And I don't think there are certainly members of Congress that are not, the NCAA did not endear themselves to Congress by handling this issue that well. So I think it's just another reason for people to say, if they want to, we can't trust the NCAA. Look at what they've done here, and they've known about this for a long time. This wasn't something that took them by surprise. It was supposed to be an emphasis, supposed to be a focus. So if they can't do this, how can we trust them to do anything else? So I don't know if they still have time. There's certainly time for them to lobby Congress and to get Congress to act. And if they get Congress to act, they won't need the states. But and if they pass NIL legislation that makes enough people in Congress happy and makes enough states happy so they all back off, there's still a concern. And the concern would be, okay, the states have backed off for now, but what's to stop a state from acting in a month or 2 or 3 months? I think the NCAA wants not only the other folks to back off, but they want this protection. They don't want to have to deal with this every year, every 6 months, where there's another lawsuit or there's another state law. That's why I think even if it's relatively narrow, their holy grail is to get Congress to give them preemption of these state laws and to give them an exemption from the antitrust attacks. And as you said, if Congress decides to do that, they're going to make sure they get something back in return from the NCAA. So this may all get decided at the federal level. Or Congress may say, you know what, we can't agree on anything either. You can just have to fight this out through the courts.
Oof. It is. They have put themselves in just an awful situation. It just seems like such a rough situation to be in, because as any person will tell you, when you are at your most stressed is when you have the least control. And right now it seems like the NCAA has given up a lot of control over its destiny and is just sort of waiting for others to decide. After all that talk, as you said, about no, we'll take care of this. Now so much of what will happen in college sports over the next, the very near future, really, as soon as next year, is not in the hands of the NCAA. It's a rough place to be.
Yeah, I mean, the flip side of that is it's kind of like the schoolyard fight or a hockey fight or something where you kind of let it go a little while to let them sort itself out. But then if it gets out of hand and too many people are fighting the one person, then the people come in and break up the fight. Maybe the Congress looks at that and says, well, wait a minute. The NCAA is getting pummeled right now. They're getting pummeled by lawsuits. They're getting pummeled by the states. They're getting pummeled by the media. We need to come in and protect them because we do want to save college sports. And the NCAA has made a lot of mistakes, but ultimately they have allowed and helped create this product that we all love, and they need protection to continue this product. There are going to be some conditions to it. There are going to be some strings attached, and they're going to have to do better. And there might be an independent commission that gets involved, but it may be that they are so seemingly helpless now that this is when Congress decides, okay, we do actually need to step in. They do need our help.
Gabe Feldman, you can find him at Sports Law Guy on Twitter. He is a law professor, the director of the sports law program at Tulane University, one of our great universities down in New Orleans, at one of my favorite cities. And he's just great at explaining really complicated stuff to dummies like me. So I recommend highly anything that Gabe does. Seek it out. You will be a better and more educated college sports fan for it. Gabe, thanks so much for joining me today and helping sort some of this stuff out.
My pleasure, and thank you for the kind words.
Joining me next on the podcast is Matt Baker, my friend from the Tampa Bay Times. Matt, I think this is your first time on the show, so I appreciate you doing this and giving us an update on all the goings on in the state of Florida this spring in college football.
Sure, happy to do it. This podcast is in my rotation when I go on runs, so it's quite an honor to be on with you, Ralph.
Oh, thank you very much. That's nice of you to say. And so now I have to ask you the question: will you listen to yourself? I know some people don't like doing that.
No. Why would I do that? When we have our recorders that we have to use to make sure we transcribe and get every quote correct, and I hate listening to myself. I don't listen to myself after a radio hit. I would never watch myself on TV. I don't even read anything I write afterward because every single word I would wonder, why did I do that instead of this other one? So no, I will not listen to this. Absolutely not. Everyone else should, but not me.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to the not reading and even like not wanting to read yourself because you second guess and definitely not listening. Though I have learned that from doing this podcast over the years that you really do have to force yourself to listen to yourself to see where you can get better and where, things that you can improve on. But I hate doing it as well. Like I do not regularly listen to my own podcast because I find it even now several years in to be cringeworthy. But again, you force yourself to do it because you kind of need to do quality control. That said, I am totally with you. Generally speaking, I do not seek out the sound of my own voice.
I hear it plenty in my own ears. I'm good.
All right. So let's talk about, again, the state of Florida football, not just University of Florida, but let's just start there. And of course, the weird thing about trying to have these conversations about, hey, where does this program stand and where does that program stand? Now, Matt covers the Noles and the Gators with his job at the Tampa Bay Times, and also some other things. So not necessarily embedded with one program or the other, but the other thing is you haven't really been able to embed with any program because of COVID protocols. Give me sort of the state of where things are at Florida as far as how their spring went. Like, were you even granted any access to them throughout the spring? Were you able to lay eyes on the Gators? Was anybody able to lay eyes on the Gators throughout spring?
No, I haven't laid eyes personally on the Gators since the SEC title game. I didn't go to the Cotton Bowl. That was just a risk that we found not worth taking. And I completely agree with it. So I haven't seen them since the SEC title game, 52-46 to Bama. They did not, they closed all their practices this spring. Usually Mullen would have some open. We've seen open scrimmages before. They finished a couple weeks ago and they didn't even have a spring game, Ralph. They said, it just didn't make sense with kind of where things are. The swamp has been used and is being used as a COVID testing site. As we record this on what is today, Tuesday. Yesterday, I think they were going to plan on giving out 5,000 COVID vaccines at the swamp, and they're ramping up more and that sort of thing. So they kind of just said, you know what, it's not in our best interest, the best interest of anybody to have a spring game. We can debate the merits of that if we want, but they chose not to have it. So reporters have not seen the Gators since the Cotton Bowl, and I haven't seen them since the SEC title game.
So I guess my question to you would be better, as opposed to what have you seen, is what are you thinking about with them? In other words, like, where are your, I'm interested to see what the progress will be in this area of the team. Here's the question mark places. Obviously you probably had some Zooms with Mullen, and maybe you can supplement some of what the information you're being given with some of the questions about what this team needs to accomplish to sort of, take the next step, quote unquote.
Yeah, so there's two things that I'm kind of really interested in with this Gator program going forward, especially here in 2021. The first thing is quarterback. It's a quarterback sport. The University of Florida is a quarterback program. They just had a really good one in Kyle Trask. When I go to a game at the Swamp, I walk past 3 quarterback statues of the guys who won Heisman's. So, and Mullen is a quarterback developer. That is what he has done through his whole career. So you go from Kyle Trask, who he wasn't a statue back there, but he was not going to beat you with his legs a whole lot. He could slide around and move in the pocket, but really he was a very good passer. And then you change that and go to Emory Jones. Emory is a very interesting guy because he's been on the radar for such a long time. Dan Mullen was the first guy to offer him, first head coach to offer him a scholarship after Emory's freshman year of high school, back when Mullen was at Mississippi State. Soon after Mullen took the Florida job, after coming over from Starkville, one of his top priorities was getting Emory. Florida had Matt Corral committed at quarterback. That didn't work out. Corral went to Ole Miss and has obviously done well for himself there. And Mullen on signing day was able to get Emory Jones to flip from Urban Meyer and the Buckeyes and sign with Florida. So he's been the quarterback of the future the whole time. He is the first quarterback Mullen signed at Florida as a head coach. He is the guy, and the Gators are going to sink or swim with him. And it's just interesting because he's such a different skill set than Kyle Trask. Emory Jones is an elusive runner. Slippery, I think, is kind of the word I would use to describe him. He's got a good arm, too. And Mullen talked about that a lot this spring, that he has a cannon. He's got probably a stronger arm than Kyle Trask. I just don't know if the accuracy is there. I'm not saying it's not. I'm just saying I haven't seen enough in his couple years to have a good read on it one way or the other. So that's kind of the first thing that's interesting to me about the Gators program. The second one is just Dan Mullen's long-term future. The NFL has been kind of whispered about for the last couple of years. The whispers were louder this offseason. He said he did not interview with an NFL, for a head coaching job, and I have no reason to doubt what he told us. But there are definitely a lot of whispers around Gainesville about whether he wants to get to the league at some point, and the question would be when and in what situation. Mullen's just a very interesting situation, I guess, at Florida, because you can look at what he's done. Winning the East last year, the 3 New Year's Six bowls. First 2 seasons were quite fine, and then this one was 8-4, and a dud down the stretch, and obviously all the off-field stuff, the brawl against Missouri, and wearing the Darth Vader mask or costume, and wanting to pack the swamp, and all that kind of stuff, plus the NCAA probation. It was
an eventful year for Dan. Yeah, it really was an eventful season.
Absolutely. And good, bad, and ugly, I would say, all 3. And that's kind of added up to a whole lot of, I don't know what his long-term future is in Gainesville. There's a lot of people there who certainly want him to stick around for a long time, but I know his antics also upset some people up there. So those are, to me, Emory and Mullen are kind of the 2 most interesting things surrounding Florida right now.
Is there a general sense of satisfaction with him among a fan base that has, in many ways, I know Andy Staples talks about this a lot, and Andy is obviously been in the national beat for a long time, but he cut his teeth on the Gators beat, and I think all college football fans to a certain degree can be a little bit delusional about their program.
Correct.
And they can all be a little entitled as far as when they've had success, they expect success all the time. But there is something different, a little nouveau about Florida's success. It's not a program with a long history of success. It's a program that became great in the 90s, won some championships. Urban came and won some championships. So there's always a sense, from talking with Andy, that they're not totally, like, they're maybe a little less grounded in reality and like what should be expected of your program there in Gainesville than maybe some other fan bases. And again, I hate to paint with a broad brush, but because everybody can be a little delusional in college football. That said, is there the sense from sort of the fan base that, okay, now we got a guy who is up to our, get the program to our level of satisfaction. This looks like a person who can contend for national championships, which is where we should be. The Gators should be contending for national championships, and this looks like a coach who can do that.
I think there are certainly some people who think that, but look, there are questions. This offense the Gators just had was really, really good. Florida, going back to the Spurrier days, they've been known for offense, and you could make a case this was, if not the best in school history, one of the best. And they went 8-4. I mean, let's kind of put that in perspective there, where you had an offense that was good enough to be in the playoff, that put up 46 on Bama and played Bama better than anybody else did all year. And they went 8-4 and got blown out in the Cotton Bowl. And they lost it to a LSU game at home that was depleted, and the secondary was depleted with a very young quarterback and all that stuff. So there are still questions about it. The question I have on Mullen, can he do this or not, is can he recruit at the level necessary? I've heard you say a couple times on this show that at some point Georgia's going to have the dudes. I mean, Georgia is recruiting at such a high level. At some point, it's going to work. Mm-hmm. At some point, they're going to break through, and I think you're probably right in that. So the question is, can Mullen, if he's not getting the type of dudes that Georgia is getting year in and year out, can he scheme his way to wins? Straight up, X's and O's whites, I will take Dan Mullen over Kirby Smart every single day. But if Kirby has a lot better players or more of the 5 stars, generally speaking, then that's going to be really hard for Dan to do what he did at the cocktail party in Jacksonville this past year. So that's really one of the unknowns surrounding Mullen. You can make a case that he can break them through that next level because, again, they were 6 points away from beating Bama. But the fact is they didn't, and I think they're going to take a step back this year just because the way the roster kind of breaks down and what they're losing.
Yeah, not only losing Trask, but losing Kadarius Toney and Kyle Pitts, who might both be first-round draft picks. Pitts obviously will be a top 5 or 10 pick, and Toney very well end up may end up as a first-round draft pick too. So some definitely rebuilding on that side of the ball. They also brought in a bunch of transfers as far as running backs are concerned. So there'll be some interesting weapons there and some interesting things for Mullen to play with offensively. I think the Gators should be very good. How good, I guess, is the question there. How good, very good, excellent, just good. When we flip over to the other team that you cover a lot, the question is, can the Noles even be pretty good anymore? Like, where are they? It's a difference between where at Florida, they're thinking like, how close are we to national championships? At Florida State, a place where they haven't been in ages, since pre-Bobby Bowden, it's, are we going to be a winning team? Again, you haven't had a chance to see much of Florida State. They're obviously running their show a little more open, as we talked about before we started recording, under Norvell, but these have not been normal times. So the access that you might have had has been shut down because of the pandemic. Where is Mike Norvell heading into year 2 of what has turned out to be a massive rebuilding project?
Yeah, FSU's let's face it, their roster is not in the best shape. The team Norvell inherited was the least talented of the modern recruiting era, of the Rivals era. And that's not his fault. His first recruiting class, he can only do so much. That's the fault of his predecessors and what they left behind. I don't know what to make of FSU. Here's what I do know. Take what happened last year and throw it out the window. I really feel that with Norvell, and really just about every first-year coach. I feel the same way about Jeff Scott down here in Tampa at USF. You take what happened last year and pretty much ignore it. They didn't have a spring, or those type of coaches had very little spring. New coach trying to get to know the personnel, and then you don't have the spring to evaluate them and figure out what they do well. What are the areas we need to hit in the transfer portal, that sort of thing. So yeah, FSU was not good last year. They were in fact bad. I don't know how they beat North Carolina. I still think that was one of the most stunning games, not only result in the state, not only in the ACC, in the entire country. I still have no idea how that happened, but just pretend that didn't happen. So to me, the Mike Norvell era really starts Saturday in their spring game. I'm going to go up there and I want to see with my own eyes what sort of progress they're making, because this should be the time when we start to see what a Mike Norvell team will look like. I think there's going to be more growing pains this year for them as they grow. But I made the case on TampaBay.com a couple weeks ago. I see a path to them being good again. Maybe not great again, but them being good. And here's how I'll lay it out. They brought in a ton of transfers. Mckenzie Milton at quarterback being the most notable. But the 7 transfers they've already got have 72 Power 5 starts and plus 54 at UCF. If those guys play well and the team makes a big improvement, again, I'm not saying they're going to challenge Clemson, but if they move into 8 wins or something like that, it's a big if, but if it happens, you factor that, you take that and then you couple it with how they've been doing on the recruiting trail. As I look here today, they're 10th in the country. They've got a pair of 5-star commits and a blue chip quarterback. If they can start showing some proof of concept on the field this year, not being great, just showing proof of concept that Mike Norvell knows what he's doing, and he can do this at the ACC level. You add in the start of a nice recruiting class, you can see a path to FSU being good and nationally relevant again. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I'm saying you can see that. And it's the first time I have seen an optimistic trajectory possible for the Noles really since the opening kickoff of the Willie Taggart era when they got blown out at home to Virginia Tech.
Yeah, I think in some ways it's a blessing and a curse. I think that it's easy. Easy might not be the right word, but because of simple location and tradition and history, you can find a path for Florida State to get well quickly. Right. Right. They're already recruiting well, even in down years. It's not like they're recruiting at number 80 in the country. Right. Though I guess a couple of years ago they might have been close to that for a little while. But yeah, even in a down year, they're going to recruit okay. So, right. If you just get a little bit of positive momentum, that thing can snowball quickly. I want to get back to the transfer situation and especially Mackenzie Milton. Now you're going to get a chance to see with your own eyes what that looks like. Mackenzie Milton, the idea of him playing again would be such an amazing story. Even if he's just a backup who plays a little, it would be a remarkable story considering the injury he had at UCF and not playing at all for 2 years. It is hard for me to be optimistic that he could be a starting quarterback again, but I'm wondering what you're hearing. Do you think, is he legitimately part of a competition to start, or is the idea, hey, here's a kid who's a really great leader and he will provide us depth and we'll see what happens from there? So I guess, have they laid out what the expectations are for Mackenzie Milton, like publicly? And I wonder what you might be hearing privately on what the expectations are for Mackenzie Milton. He has said he has felt good. He talked, I think it was after the first week of spring ball, and he felt good. They were going to be, treat him with a little bit with kid gloves, but look, he was a full go. So I think the expectation is that he is going to compete for the starting job. I think at worst, the reason I like the Mackenzie Milton pickup, it was a low risk thing. It's a young quarterback room with, it's got some experience because all 3 of the other ones started last year, which is crazy and says a lot about how the season went. But they don't have like an established dude in that quarterback room. And Mackenzie Milton can be that guy. I know he obviously the success he had at UCF. He's a leader. He knows how to win. All that stuff can really, I think, show the younger quarterbacks, the Jordan Travis and Chubba Purdy and Tate Rodemaker, the kind of the ropes and how to act like an established leader, how to establish yourself like that. So that was kind of the low end of what Mackenzie Milton brings. And at best, then maybe he is like he was at UCF. I'm still, again, I want to see with my own eyes first, but the fact that he was going through spring ball, that he said he felt good and all that stuff, I think those are all signs that maybe there's a chance he's going to be the starter. And honestly, his job got a little bit easier. They had to shut down I think their quarterback of the future and Chubba Purdy had to shut him down with an injury earlier this spring. So Mackenzie Milton, I think, is absolutely viable. So I hear from a lot of coaches the idea that, hey, with the transfer portal, rebuilding is going to be a different animal, and we have the ability to turn over some rosters a lot faster than ever before. As much as a lot of coaches bitch and moan about the transfer portal and the headaches that it brings in maintaining your roster, if you are in a situation where, hey, this team I have doesn't quite look right, or I'm taking over a new team and I need some help here, it opens up a brave new world. What is Norvell? What is Norvell talked about when it comes to the idea of sort of fitting new pieces in? Like, that's a lot of new pieces that they're going to rely upon. This isn't the pros where kids just, hey, yeah, I'm here to play, right? Like, that's like pros understand that, hey, there's going to be a whole bunch of new guys who might come in next year and you're going to have to fight for your job, but they're bringing in guys who can be better than you were. In a college atmosphere, that kind of turnover, I wonder how that plays. Especially when you're a new coach trying to establish your culture. What's Norvell talked about and said about trying to implement that?
Yeah, I mean, look, when he got in, his first really the first calendar year toward the end of this past season, there was a ton of attrition. A lot of guys left for one reason or another. Some of them were forced out. Some of them just didn't like the direction. Some of them didn't fit. And again, that happens every time there's a coaching change. It was more with Florida State this year, or in that past year, than most. But I think FSU needed to go the transfer route the same way that Miami did a couple years ago when they hit it really, really, really hard. Just because it was one of the youngest, the Noles were one of the youngest teams in the country last year. They didn't have like a lot of veteran defensive linemen or that sort of thing. They needed, again, they didn't have a other than Blackman, who ended up opting out and transferring. They didn't have a lot of, they didn't have a veteran voice in the quarterback room. So they needed some experienced guys. And they brought, was it 7 of them in with an 8th coming from Kansas, Andrew Parchment, at some point in the offseason. So they needed to do that. Yes, there was a risk that it kind of upset some people in the locker room, but the reward of, if those people don't work out, you can replace them one way or another, and hopefully it does work out and they add some experience and veteran leadership and teach the younger guys what to do. I think that was a risk that Norvell needed to take.
Is there has Florida State recalibrated on what to expect on the building job that is necessary there? No, listen, I mean, Willie Taggart was out after 2 years, not even a full 2 years. Mike Norvell,
21 games.
Yeah, Mike Norvell is going to go into his second year, and Mike Norvell's first year wasn't even as good as Willie Taggart's first year, which was not good. So, I mean, we can get into all the ramifications and the idea of what, how the black coach was treated to how the white coach was treated. Clearly, though, there is also a shift with, I think there was a come to Jesus kind of reality, accept the reality moment for a lot of Florida State fans. And I think the administration was like, wow, this is really bad. We are in a really, really big, deep hole. And also Willie, I don't think, did a good job of lifting them out. Right. So I say that to lead up to the question of going into year 2, is there, again, this recalibration among Florida State, not just fans, but the administration, that, okay, we probably need a little more patience here. This year 2 for Mike Norvell is like sort of the next step, and maybe year 3 we will see exactly where, we will expect more progress. Like we need progress this year. As you said, there's a chance they could be sneaky progress. They could progress quickly, but not just on the field, but with facilities and things like that. There seems to be a large building going on here, a large building project going on here. Do they have the stomach for that?
I think they do. You're exactly right on the Taggart versus Norvell thing, but there are a lot of differences there. Obviously, the pandemic, that's a pretty big,
very big difference.
And what Norvell was able to do, I mean, like physically, literally able to do that didn't apply with Taggart. What did Taggart in was the apathy in the fan base, that they said, we just give up. He's not going to do it, and it's not going to happen. And that was costing a lot of money in terms of the empty seats. And then the lack of progress, Ralph. The most interesting thing and the most damning thing David Coburn, the AD, said on the day after he fired Willie was that the first game against Virginia Tech looked a lot like the last one against Miami.
Yeah, I agree with
that. And I think that was 100% right. Yeah. The issues were the same and they weren't being fixed. So, I think to some degree, FSU needed the Taggart era and those struggles to show some of the cracks there. Like the FSU didn't get this bad, the worst since the early, year one and the previously before Bobby Bowden. It's the last time they were this bad. It didn't happen overnight. It happened because of a bunch of different reasons. It happened because of the way the culture sagged at the end of the Jimbo era, the way recruiting sagged with either not getting enough quality players or not getting enough quality workers and that sort of thing, with the way this staff got stale, with a lot of administrative stuff and people not pushing or pulling in the same direction. So it's going to, I think the Willie Taggart era and how rough it was showed all the cracks for everybody to see, and then they can start filling them. And that's a process that's going to take time. And I think the administration understands that. I think the rational Florida State fans understand that as well. We talked about some Gator fans can be a little delusional. And my favorite message board thing the past couple of weeks was after Deion Sanders won either the first or second game at Jackson State. Somebody, there was an FSU message board or one of the crazies saying that, well, it's clear Mike Norvell is not going to be the guy after this past year. That's obvious. There's no denying that. We need to hire Deion Sanders right now because Coach Prime is clearly headed for greatness and he can't do it somewhere else. He needs to do it back home at Florida State. So there is definitely that. I just thought that was fantastic. There's definitely some of that, but I think most rational Noles fans know it's going to take some time. And I think they're going to give, as long as there's progress being made this year and next year, I think Norvell is going to be okay.
Are they going to have a new facility? Because, it's weird to say that Florida State is behind, but for people who haven't been through there, for people who know the lay of the land, they understand that, yeah, Florida State's behind in facilities. I think for folks who look at Florida State as one of the premier programs in the country, not that far removed from a national championship, to say that they are a little behind the times in facilities sounds weird, but they have been. What are the plans there?
Yeah, so I guess it was just last week, Florida State, the Seminole Boosters talked with the board of directors and got approval to start looking at some renovations to Doak Campbell Stadium, where they would change kind of the way some of the seating is structured. They opened this new club seating area, and I think it was 2016, and they realized this is way too big. We need to downsize this. So they're going to downsize it, do different kinds of seating options, that sort of thing. So that's one of the priorities where that, again, they got approval to kind of explore that option just last week. The idea of a football complex, the standalone facility that everybody has, that has been in the works for, Jimbo wanted it. That's what he wanted on his way out. And just the start of the Willie Taggart era, they started talking about making that happen. And it's still just in the planning stage. At some point, I think it's going to happen, but there's a lot of issues, one of which is certainly financial, that's going to happen between now and then. So it's not like they're particularly close on that. The Gators don't have a standalone football center either, but that's happening. It's construction on that is beginning very, very soon. But Florida State, they're a step or two behind that.
Okay, so again, Matt is deep in the weeds with the Noles and the Gators. Not quite as much with the Hurricanes, but you're also an AP college football voter, so you keep an eye on the rest of the country. And as much as Florida is an enormous state, and really Miami is really not that close to even Tampa, where you live, but nonetheless, I'll ask you about the Hurricanes because they got so badly exposed at the end of last season that it seemed like a lot of the progress that Manny Diaz made down there in year two, and essentially almost sort of went out the window. And I think for a lot of people was dismissed as, well, yeah, they beat some teams, but they really weren't that good. And we found out at the end of the season that they really weren't that good. Again, not talking about the confidence level of fans. That's kind of a beaten down fan base. But when you sort of glance down south, how much do you come away with optimism because overall it was a good year and much better than the year before, or maybe it was all fool's gold?
I don't think it was fool's gold. I think this is just where Miami is right now. I think they're a good program, but not a great one. I think honestly, Ralph, I think it's that simple. It's been a while since Miami was consistently good. We think about the Canes and the U and their glory days and the 5 national championships and all that stuff. But let's face it, it's been a while since they've been like that. And there's been a lot of different coaches that have come through and had flashes of success. Obviously, in 2017, the Orange Bowl team was good and entertaining, but I mean, they got their tails beat by Clemson. So it's not like they were an elite team. I just think this is where Miami is, and I'm viewing them through that prism. So I looked at last year as definitely a step forward for Manny Diaz. Again, he's used the transfer portal better than maybe anybody in the country, to be honest with you, in terms of getting guys like Jalen Phillips out of UCLA to have a rebirth of his career and have a second team All-American season. De'Ara King, giving him a second chance coming from Houston and him developing into one of the better quarterbacks in the ACC. So I think the way he's built his program, it's not, you don't want to build it through transfers, but Manny has realized what he's needed to do and done it accordingly. And I think a reason I would be optimistic kind of long-term on Miami is the offensive progress that they made. The defense was not good. That they got exposed against Clemson. They got really, really exposed against North Carolina. But I think Manny's going to be able to turn that around. But it was the offense and the progress they showed. Because, I mean, I've seen enough Canes games the last few years where their offense was just awful. And the way they redid things with De'Ara King at quarterback and Rhett Lashley with an offense, spread it out, get it to the playmakers. Because Miami always has playmakers, and they always should have playmakers. So I think that's kind of the blueprint of how you can build Miami into and have them go from that good program to a very good one. I don't know if it's going to happen just because it hasn't happened in a while, and there's a lot of reasons for that. ACC money, and after you become stagnant for a little bit, it becomes harder to get that train going in the right direction. But I didn't view Miami as a disappointment last year the same way that I viewed Florida as a disappointment or a failure. I view that as a positive step forward that ended because they weren't good enough yet, and it's going to take a little more time.
Is it possible for the big three in Florida, and sorry, UCF fans, but we'll get to you in a second. Is it possible that the big three, Florida State, and Miami, can all be operating at a very highly functioning level at the same time?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And
yeah, I know it's a big question there. So
I've given this a ton of thought because that is my summer project.
Okay.
Spoiler alert here. Thanks for giving it away. But read all about it on TampaBay.com in a couple months. I think it's a very valid question because if you look, I mean, Florida is in the longest period. The state of Florida is in its longest national championship drought since they started winning national titles with Schnellenberger and the Canes in '83. I'm excluding the UCF thing here. Sorry, I just am. I think the way recruiting has gone, where it's so much more national than it used to be 20 years ago, and the way Florida is so heavily recruited. I mean, it's always been recruited. Tommy Frazier, maybe the best player of my lifetime, was from Manatee High School, about an hour from here, and obviously went to Nebraska. But it's just gone up another level in how competitive it is down here. And then you factor in the fact that there are, the UCF and USF are here, and they weren't in this position 30 years ago. I go back to, I wrote before the title game in Miami this past year. I looked at look at the last two national championship games in the state of Florida. When Clemson and Bama had the thriller with 1 second left, Deshaun Watson to Hunter Renfrow, y'all know what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. Clemson won that game in Tampa, 20 minutes from my house, built with a roster that had a lot of Florida kids. Artavius Scott, Deion Kane, Ray McLeod, all from 45 minutes away from Tampa or less. And they won a national championship in Florida with Florida kids. Florida teams were not close. Then look at this past year, the national championship game in Miami with Ohio State and Alabama. Look at the guys who were on that team. I mean, Sean Wade from Florida, Patrick Surtain from Florida, Evan Neal and Alex Leatherwood, good offensive linemen for Bama from Florida. Nicholas Petty-Frere, starting right tackle for Ohio State from Tampa. So again, the state of Florida was hosting a national championship game with a bunch of players from the state of Florida and no team from the state of Florida being close to it. And that's just kind of the way it's been. And I don't know that it can change, honestly. I think that the haves are, and the Clemsons and Bamas, they're not going away. And the way recruiting has gone, certainly at Georgia and some of those schools, they keep taking a lot of the good Florida players. And if you take a couple of those, you take away a couple of those good linemen that played in the national title game and put them on the Gators might have beaten Bama. But it's just spread out so much. And I don't know that the state of Florida can sustain 3 championship programs again. I really don't.
Okay, let's tap into the 2 AAC schools, one in your backyard there, USF, and one across the what's the road that connects those 2 cities, or that goes across the middle of the state? Is it 10?
Interstate 4. I-4.
Is it 4?
One of the worst stretches of highway in the country. It's always gridlock.
And I should know this because my parents live, on the east coast of Florida, a little farther north, and we take 4 to go to Disney. Well, at least we used to, when my daughter was of the age where she thought Disney was cool. But regardless, so let me hit on UCF first and the Gus Malzahn hiring. So the one thing I took away, the main takeaway I got from Gus's first day on the job, when that day he was hired and a lot of us watched that news conference, was like, wow, that's a different kind of high energy Gus. Like, I wonder if, Terry Mahoja, the new AD, kind of sat him down and said, listen, like, we are not a program that, like, we are a program that has to have a lot of like selling and energy. And like, this is sort of the way we are brash. We are bold. We are new. We can't like sort of sit back and just be, a revered SEC program. I need you to match that. Like, I know you're a good coach, Gus, but I kind of need you to match this energy. And we saw a lot of that energy. Now, again, I know you haven't been around that program, but I guess, have you gotten a sense that like this is a different type of Gus? And how do you think that hire will work out?
I think it's UCF being very open and forceful. I was driving to pick up dinner the other night. Again, I'm in Tampa, and I passed a billboard that said the future of college football is at UCF or in Orlando, and how many miles it was to Orlando. And they're doing the same thing in Tallahassee and Miami. They're really trying to grow their brand, and credit to Gus for showing a different side of personality and trying to tap into that. Look, I still think Gus Malzahn's really, really sharp. I know Auburn things were weird there at times, but I think that's more about Auburn than it is about him. But before I came to Tampa, I worked in Tulsa, and I know how highly people there thought of him. Where he had a 3,000-yard passer, a 1,000-yard receiver, a 1,000-yard rusher one year, then turned around and had a 5,000-yard passer in Paul Smith. He was able at Tulsa to fit the system and fit the offense to the personnel he had very, very well. And I think so. And that's to me the sign of a really good coach, like Mullen at Florida. I still think he can be that guy. It's just a matter, I think Auburn didn't work out for him. And after a while, it becomes really, really hard to get things going again. So I think the UCF is the breath that, just the reboot that he needs. And I think he's got a chance to do a really, really good job there. He recruits at a very good level. Not the super elite level, but a fine level at Auburn, and has recruited the heck of Florida before. Back-to-back years, he had the top kid in the Tampa area. He got him to Auburn, including Byron Coward, who's one of the top couple of recruits in the country from Armwood High School, just off I-4. So I think Gus is going to do a very good job there. I don't know if he has another job in him after this, if this is a springboard or if this is just the way to kind of wind down. I don't know what his long-term plans are, but I think it's the refresh that he needed.
Yeah, I think Gus is a very good coach. Like Gus, it wasn't that it wasn't working out at Auburn. It wasn't working out at Auburn for the standard Auburn wanted, but he wasn't bad at Auburn. They were still winning games and being very competitive at a very high level. I think as long as Gus doesn't pull sort of a Tommy Tuberville and think of it as a retirement job, if he goes into it wanting to work hard at it, and I see no indication that he will not, that's a good match because it's a really good job. I mean, it's a job that they have been to 3 BCS/CFP games or New Year's Six games with 3 different coaches. I'm not saying it runs itself. They've regressed a little bit over the last couple of years under Heupel, but not to the point where they're looking to rebuild. I think that could be a really great marriage. Now, I say all those like flowery great things about UCF and how it's like sort of if you talk to people in the industry, quote unquote, in the industry, coaches and agents and search firm folks, they'll tell you that that's pretty much as good a Power 5 job as you can get. And then we look at USF, and a lot of times I think it's natural inclination to sort of think like, oh, that must be as good a place to go to as UCF, right? Because they're in Florida too, right? They have all those players around them. But it's been far harder for USF to maintain. They've had some pretty good highs, but they have had a much harder time sort of maintaining a high level of performance. And they've had some really deep valleys like last year 1 under Jeff Scott. It's still considered a place where that's a very desirable spot, which is why Jeff Scott, after being a hard guy to pull out of Clemson, ended up there, because I think that there is a pretty high ceiling at USF. But why is it also a place with a kind of a low floor?
Well, for starters, it's still a young program. I mean, this is, I believe, the 25th year of USF football. And that includes just the program starting out from nothing. So I think that's part of it. There's just, I guess the big thing is the infrastructure. They don't have an on-campus stadium like the Bounce House at UCF. They play their games at the Buck Stadium, Raymond James Stadium, which is half hour from campus, 20 minutes, somewhere along those lines, depending on traffic and everything. So when it's good and bad playing in a situation like that. Same with, like, for example, yeah, you get to play in an NFL stadium, and that's a cool thing to tell recruits because they all want to make it to the league. They're playing at one of the best in the country that just hosted a Super Bowl, so that's pretty cool. But at the same time, if you're trying to build enthusiasm and buzz on campus, not playing walking distance or a short bus ride away, that's a major challenge, just in terms of building that on-campus community and the buzz and all that stuff that I think makes college football great. And then you go to the campus itself; their facilities are not good. They're not good enough. And to USF's credit, they're in the process of fixing it. It's been, I think in 2017 is when it was, they started really talking about a new football facility. And finally, now here we are in 2021, they're doing some stuff where they're going to redo the locker rooms and team facilities here starting in the next couple of weeks. And then they don't have an indoor practice facility, Ralph. Like, I think a lot of the facilities stuff is stupid and overblown, but not having an indoor practice facility in the state of Florida, where, spoiler alert, it rains every day from during the summer and into the fall, that's a major issue. But to their credit, they're going to start working on that later this year and potentially have that up and running by sometime next year. So that's kind of the biggest issue for them, is they don't have the institutional commitment, or haven't had the institutional commitment and the infrastructure to show that this is a school that cares about football. And if you don't have that, it's hard to really get things going.
So why is there a reason to be optimistic about what Jeff Scott's got going on down there? I mean, again, he's trying to bring that Clemson little bit of Dabo, and Jeff Scott really, if for folks who maybe aren't as familiar with Jeff Scott, if there were anybody of all the people who have worked with Dabo who is sort of most Dabo-ish, it is Jeff Scott. He is
absolutely.
He is an extremely positive person. He is chatty, not quite like Dabo, as far as once you get him going, you almost think he'll never stop. But he's got a lot of like sort of Dabo in him, so that's appealing in many ways. But they were really terrible last year, really, really terrible last year. Why is there some hope that year 2 will be better?
Because, again, last year was the pandemic, and I think they got to do one spring practice, and this year they got to beat that. They did all of them, so hey, that's something. So I think that's part of it. They were hurt a lot by injuries and just the weird coronavirus stuff. I mean, Cade Fortin, the North Carolina transfer at quarterback, he played well in his little limited action. And he left this spring game as the presumptive starter. I was pretty impressed with him, but he didn't get to do a lot last year because he was injured and there were COVID issues. So again, I just don't think you can take a lot away from last year. Again, I'm not saying they're going to be great. It's a building process. But if I'm giving you the long-term glass half full case for USF, Jeff Scott is a good evaluator of talent. I think we saw that at Clemson. He's a good recruiter who recruited the heck out of this area when he was at Clemson. And I think USF can be really, really good in the transfer portal going forward. Depending on how all this stuff shakes out with the transfer rules and changing and what have you, we're going to keep seeing players transfer. And a lot of them are going to be coming from, Florida natives, went somewhere else, didn't work, want to play closer to home. And Jeff Scott will have evaluated some of them at Clemson already, might have relationships with some of them or be able to build them quickly the way he did getting Jaron Williams, the Miami transfer, as a quarterback of this past year. So I think Jeff's going to be able to do that very well, evaluating talent and then getting some guys who didn't work out at Kansas State or Auburn or whatever it may be, and getting them to come closer to home to Tampa. So I think that's kind of the case I would make for Jeff Scott and why they might be able to build things. It's going to take time just because the Bulls haven't done it at a consistent level. But I think it's a chance for the program to grow and Scott to grow with it.
Well, Matt, I'm glad that we are getting back to normal, that you will be at a spring game on Saturday. Now, spring games are, generally speaking, in normal times, not exactly something that you would get fired up to cover. It's, a lot of times it's a nice day and it's a relatively easy assignment. So there's that. But, I got to imagine you might actually be a little fired up to be at a spring game on Saturday.
I am so freaking excited for this, Ralph. I'm not going to take any of this stuff for granted. I've seen my share of practices and scrimmages, and you're watching guys stretch, and it's really not the most interesting thing. But after this past year, I am so excited to get out, to see something resembling football, to learn things about a team, to do my job in person, actually getting to talk to some people, rather than just being cooped up with my snoring dog in the corner of the office. I'm not going to take this stuff for granted again. And some of that is a spring game, and hopefully it's interesting and a beautiful day, and I don't hit any traffic on I-10.
Well, I'm sure your dog and your wife will be happy to get you out of the house a little bit. So Matt Baker,
that is accurate.
Matt Baker does a great job for the Tampa Bay Times, covering the Noles and the Gators and a lot of other things in the state of Florida having to do with football, even some non-football stuff. So definitely give him a follow and seek out his work. Matt, thanks so much for coming on and give us the state of football in Florida here as we sort of wind down spring football. Appreciate your time, Matt.
Sure. Thank you.
And now 3 and out. First down. I know you don't necessarily come here for my basketball takes, but after watching Baylor's amazing title game takedown of Gonzaga, I was thinking about Zags coach Mark Few. Few has been leading Gonzaga for 22 years. His predecessor, Dan Monson, lit the fuse at Gonzaga, but Few has been the guy who has led the program from upstart mid-major to college basketball powerhouse. You hear a lot about how Few has done so much in his time at Gonzaga, but hasn't been able to break through with a national title, which is true, but also lacking some really important context. The Gonzaga that we have seen in the last several seasons is a very different creature than what it was for the first decade or so of Few's tenure. Up until about 2013, Gonzaga was a great mid-major program that could compete with the big boys, but it wasn't producing NBA players and, more importantly, high NBA draft picks the way it has in more recent years, really about the last 5 or 6 years. This Gonzaga is operating far more similarly to the likes of Kansas and North Carolina. But this Gonzaga has really only been around for about 5 years, and it seems like it's not going anywhere. Again, I'm not a basketball expert, but as Jalen Suggs likely departs, the Zags have a commitment from another elite recruit from kind of a one-and-done type ceiling player for next year. I can't help but think about Villanova under Jay Wright when I think about Gonzaga currently. Because Villanova is in the Big East and it already has a national title to its credit back in 1985, the Wildcats were never pigeonholed to mid-major status the way Gonzaga was for years. The West Coast Conference is nice, but it ain't the Big East, not now, and certainly not when it was the mega conference with the likes of Syracuse and Louisville before the breakup. Still, I think Villanova is a good comp. Wright and his team were considered tournament underachievers for about 15 years. And then they rattled off 2 national championships, and that was that. Think about it. John Calipari has 1 national title in 20 years at Memphis and Kentucky, 2 really big-time programs, well-established national title type contending programs. Bill, especially Kentucky, one of the crown jewels of all of college basketball. Bill Self has 1 national title in 18 years at Kansas. Roy Williams won 3 before retiring last week. Good luck, Roy. In 30 years of coaching at 2 crown jewel type programs in the sport, North Carolina and Kansas. Jim Boeheim has 1 at Syracuse in 45 years. As great as Coach K is, maybe the greatest resume in the sport, other than John Wooden, of course, he has 5 titles in 40 years, and it took him 11 years to win his first at an ACC school with some history of basketball success. Few has Gonzaga situated in a place now where it looks as if it will be a legit national title contender year in and year out for a while. That's a new development at Gonzaga, and my guess is if he keeps them in the mix for several more years, the Zags will grab a national title. But it's not really fair to say Few has been chasing that title for 2 decades, because most of that time was spent building Gonzaga into a program that could actually contend for a national title. And that he now has that type of program at a small Jesuit school in Spokane, Washington that plays in the West Coast Conference is really the most amazing accomplishment of all when it comes to Few and Gonzaga. Second down, Kansas has its new AD after almost a month looking for one. Travis Goff, a KU alum who has been at Northwestern as a deputy AD, was hired earlier this week. Now the question is what to do with the head football coaching job. There are 2 schools of thought. A, don't hire a permanent replacement for Les Miles now and wait until after the 2021 season. The thought behind this approach is, at this point, it is so late in the year that the 2021 season cannot be salvaged by a new coach. And in fact, bringing somebody in might trigger a bunch of portal defections and make a bad team even worse. No matter who the coach is, it'll be a year 0. So just ride it out with interim coach Emory Jones. And then after the 2021 season, you might have found your guy. Who knows? Maybe Jones is that guy and you get a chance to assess him. Or you may have a deeper pool of candidates from which to choose your next coach. How about this as an idea? Justin Fuente's situation at Virginia Tech is not exactly stable. Fuente is from Oklahoma and was an assistant at TCU. There's a guy who might look at the opportunity to start fresh in the Big 12 as a nice alternative to getting fired after another 6 or 7 win season with the Hokies. Waiting also delays the clock starting on the new AD, so to speak. The disastrous season goes on Jeff Long's ledger, and Goff can go the next 8 months positioning KU for its next step without sullying his resume, so to speak, again, with an 0-12 season under a new coach who never had a fighting chance. Lastly, the coaches who are interested in the job now, Lance Leipold from Buffalo, Jeff Monken from Army, maybe Willie Fritz from Tulane, though I'm a little more skeptical about that last one, they will all still be interested in the job in December, which leads to why the alternative route might be more attractive. B, hire a coach now. No reason to procrastinate on rebuilding the worst football program in Power 5, maybe in all of FBS, if you consider that a program with Power 5 resources should never get this bad. The other advantage to hiring now is Kansas has no competition for the coaches who would likely take the job. You might think the candidate pool is a little thin now, but come December, Kansas could be fighting to hire a coach with as solid a track record as Leipold or Monken. And these days, Kansas is not well positioned to beat other programs in the market for a new coach. I'm not sure which way Kansas will go. As of this recording, Goff has not held an introductory news conference. It will be interesting to see if he states right up front what the plan is. There are definitely rumors that KU is leaning toward Plan A and waiting to hire a coach. Third down, one last bit of AD news. Wisconsin made it official right before we started recording. Barry Alvarez is retiring as AD effective the end of June. We talked a little bit about this last week. Alvarez's 3 decades as coach and athletic director transformed the Badgers. Conventional wisdom and speculation is that Wisconsin will, no surprise here, stay in-house to replace Alvarez with Deputy Athletic Director Chris McIntosh, a former offensive lineman and team captain under Barry. Alvarez will also go down as one of the more reliably good quotes in college football. I was never quite as close to Barry as many of my colleagues. He is a reporter's dream type of guy, generally fills up a notebook and also answers his cell phone, but he never shied away from speaking his mind on the record and being quoted on subjects that others would often shy away from. God knows we could use more of that. That is the show for today. I'd like to thank my producer, Sarah McCrory, for making me sound good. You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Westwood One Podcast. Please subscribe so you do not miss an episode. If you have questions that you'd like me or maybe one of my guests to answer, email them to aptop25mailbag@gmail.com. That's aptop25mailbag, the digits 25, @gmail.com. We love to hear from you on all topics, college football, serious or silly. I'm Ralph Russo, the college football writer with the Associated Press. Thanks for listening, and come back for more next week of the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast.